a native of Shreveport. He's been an attorney who has filed 90% of police misconduct cases in Northwest Louisiana with an 11-year span. In the process, he won 2 federal verdicts against police officers who had killed an unarmed black man. Mr. Jones is a frequent guest columnist for Shreveport Times and Shreveport Sun Weekly. He also hosts 2 weekly radio shows, the Sunday School Lesson and Are You Smarter Than Adam and Eve? An ordained Baptist minister, Mr. Jones is alumnus of Dillard, as I mentioned, and he was Student Government Association president during his time at Dillard. Upon graduation, he became the first Dillard graduate to attend Harvard Law School, where he received his JD. I'm not sure how many more people went to Harvard Law after he graduated. We had one 2 years ago.
Several.
So we're honored that you joined us this afternoon. He's going to share a lot of perspective, a different perspective that most of you probably won't be familiar with. We were not familiar with it until Hersy did some research on the 13th Amendment. So it's going to be a whole kind of different kind of mindset than what we all were kind of introduced in school based off his research. So he hopes to gather this together. He's going to be publishing in the Journal of Education and Social Justice. We're going to be presenting this at the Black Caucus in September, and also hopefully formulate a book sometime next year based off his findings. So I'm going to work on Hersy to the stage.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, as my dad would say, what time is it? Good evening. I want to thank Dr. Ishmael for allowing me to come before you and to present my research. I'll tell you, I want to thank you guys for showing up. Let me give you a big round of applause. Hey, wait a minute now. I'm giving you guys a round of applause. You got to join in. And let me tell you why I'm giving you a round of applause, because education ultimately is about learning new things. And as was once told me, one of the problems with young people in learning new things is what? You know what one of the problems with young people in learning new things is? It says almost like an oxymoron. You know why they say that? Because all young people, when I was your age, when Dr. Ishmael was your age, and when my parents were your age, and the people after you, you know what all young people say? I already know that. And then what all young people say about older people? They don't really know anything. So therefore, one of the issues about young people is you learn new things, but the first thought about young people is, I really don't need to know that. So you guys I give you a round of applause because you pushed through that and said, well, maybe I learned something new, and if I already know it, then I'll just hear it again. But you're here, and I appreciate it. My topic is on, what's the name that we settled on, Dr. Ishmael? I think it's the 13th, the true purpose of the 13th Amendment. Abolish slavery or disguise it. So let me start out how I got into this. I was practicing law, and I was representing a guy in a criminal case. And I didn't normally do criminal defense. I didn't do criminal defense, and I certainly didn't do drug defense. I didn't do criminal defense because I didn't believe in representing somebody, getting them acquitted, and then they go right back into the neighborhood and commit the crime over again. So if I would represent 3 or 4, and I always would give them a speech, and the speech went like this: I'm going to get you off this, on this technicality. But if I ever hear you commit the crime again, I'm going to come out of retirement and get my baseball bat and beat the living shit out of you. And they would look at me like, what? Saying, oh, you're a Harvard lawyer. And then I grew up in a high crime neighborhood where guys I grew up with became the top drug dealers around. So I would start calling their names, and that would get their attention. So that's the same reason why I wouldn't do represent drug cases because a lot of my friends were drug dealers, and I didn't agree with what they were doing, and I didn't want any of the money. So I represented this criminal defendant. I was giving him my speech, and he was really trying to embarrass me. He was trying to put me in my place. And he did, and here's how he did it. He said, "Don't you have a law degree from Harvard?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "So you think you're pretty smart, don't you?" And I said, "Well, okay, what's the point?" He said, "Do you know the 13th Amendment didn't abolish slavery?" And what would be your reaction if somebody told you that? Any reaction?
Maybe shocked.
Huh?
Maybe shocked.
Not only was I shocked, I figured out.
Want to know more about what they're talking about?
But first, I got to give credence to what he said. I said, "What the?" And then it hit me. That's a bold statement. So I got a little armor. I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "You never read it." I was like, "Oh God, I read the 13th Amendment. I read it in law school." So I went into it a little further, and I got to thinking, and there was no internet then. I couldn't just pull it up. So he said, "Turn Joe, go get it. You got it in here." So I went and got it, and I looked at it. He said, "It doesn't even have abolish in it." And that hit me like a thunderbolt. Because obviously he was on to something. He had no high school, he had high school education, no college, no law. And here was a guy with no education talking to me with a Harvard law degree. I'd gone to the top law school in the country, and that thought had never been discussed. So over the years, I tinkered with it. I looked at it. I started writing articles related to it. So about 3 years ago, I started this research. I decided I wanted to just see, why does it say what it says? And let me find out. Do I have it here, Dr. Ishmael? What the 13th Amendment says. Anybody know what it says? It says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States except as punishment for a crime after being duly convicted." Okay? Everybody hear that? Except as punishment for a crime after being duly convicted. So I knew from being an English major here at Dillard that when a sentence has a double negative, it is not telling you what can't happen, it's telling you what can happen. Everybody understand that? And the 13th Amendment is drafted with a double negative. Neither shall there be except. And in math, if a negative times a negative, what does it equal? A positive. Same thing in English. So if I said, no one can come into class except they wear a green jacket. Right? So what am I really saying? The only people that can come in have to have a green jacket. So the 13th Amendment sounds like it's saying there shouldn't be slavery, but what it's really saying is you can have slavery if they're duly convicted. Is that what we thought the 13th Amendment was designed for? No. The language and all the literature about the 13th Amendment talks about abolishing slavery. But my prior life, I was a tax lawyer. And tax lawyers' claim to fame is we can discover and exploit loopholes in the tax legislation. And here's how that's done. It's done with legislative history. Sometimes Congress passes a law and the IRS is supposed to implement it. What the IRS does is write their interpretation of it. And sometimes what their interpretation is not consistent with what Congress said. Everybody understand that? Sometimes what the words say is not the same as what people say the words say. It's kind of like you ever listen to a song and people don't know what the songwriter is really saying. So you're like, let's look at the lyrics. Then you look at the lyrics and you say, what? You can resolve the dispute. But that's the way tax lawyers are. So I approach this subject by saying, let me just go back and do the legislative research, the legislative history of the 13th Amendment. And here's what I concluded. I'm going to start with my conclusion and I'm going to show you how I got there. I concluded that the intent of the drafters of the 13th Amendment was not to abolish slavery. That the intent of the drafters of the 13th Amendment was to provide a way for the Lincoln administration and the Republicans to say, we're ending slavery as you know it. But we're going to give the South another way to create slavery. Everybody hear what I said? Does that make sense to you? Did you expect that to be the case? Now, let me say this. There have been many other articles and studies talking about the 13th Amendment. There's a movie called 13. Anybody ever saw it? Huh? You saw it? What is 13th about?
It's about mass incarceration, you know, the 13th Amendment, the exception clause that was in the 13th Amendment.
Exactly. So I'm not the first one to talk about the except clause. There have been many articles written about the except clause, and these articles have said this except clause in the 13th Amendment paved the way for the South, after the 13th Amendment had ended one form of slavery and freed the blacks in the South, which it did, but it provided a way for what? This former slave owners in the South to re-enslave blacks by way of the criminal justice system. Everybody hear me? What's the reaction? What's your reaction to that? Because I don't see a reaction in my glasses. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't really see. Are you in shock, or are you saying that's all fine and that's what you're expecting? What's your reaction? All right. Anybody have a reaction? Let me hear it.
I mean, when I first found out about it, it was shocking, but at the same time, I just feel like America is obviously known for like deceitful things like that in the fine print, so it's like it's shocking.
Oh, don't talk over one. Come on, what'd you say?
I said basically we're just desensitized to find out.
And that's what I did by survey on this topic from my two sons and other people. They had the same reaction. That people are so negative now, they just assume that's the way it was. But here's why I want to have this presentation with you. And you're kind of like my guinea pigs. The first time I've done it with a group, I've taught Dr. Ishmael ear off and other people ear off on it for the last year and a half. This is the first time we're presenting it. It's to show, ultimately, how the law was utilized, and slavery was created by the law, but also how it was utilized to what I would say bamboozle blacks in the country. And here's why I say that. Because the 13th Amendment says it's to abolish, but it doesn't have the term abolish in it. And the intent was to abolish slavery, and it did do that, but it also had this except clause. So the movie 13 And the articles on convict leasing and 13th Amendment and the Accept Clause, other authors, they've all acknowledged that the result of the Accept Clause was mass incarceration. And what state has the highest mass incarceration rate in the world? Huh? Louisiana. And Louisiana's major state penitentiary is named what? Angola. But do you know what Angola was before it was a state penitentiary? It was a slave plantation. So in Louisiana, you can see the shift. But let me tell you how I think we got there. First off, one thing that people didn't tell us, and I want to share with you why I think it was intentional, is that in the early 1800s, before the Civil War, there was another big issue in the country in the North. And it was about wage slavery. Anybody ever heard of that? Wage slavery meant you were working, but you were getting paid so little, it was almost like nothing. And that primarily happened, was going on in the North, where there was not any slavery now. Slavery is in the South primarily, and free whites were working, and they referred to themselves as white slaves. This went on from like the 1800s to the 1850s. And one article said, when this country started in the 1700s, most workers, we're talking about white workers, were free. And here's what they meant by free. They could control their hours, they could control their wages, they were self-employed, as we call it. Now we'll say they were entrepreneurs. But over a period of time, they started leaving the farm, they started working for factories, and the employers were what? Controlling when they could go home, when they had to come to work, when they could get off. Could they leave work to go take care of a sick child? The worker controlled that. How much you're going to get paid. So therefore, they refer to themselves as what? Wage slaves. And in the North, people like Lincoln and a party called the Free Soil Party were concerned about that, and they wanted to protect the wages of what? The white workers. The Republican Party was founded in 1860, and its platform was to protect the labor of white workers. And what did they consider the number one threat to the wages of white workers? Slave labor. You know why? Anybody know why? Well, in this current day, the same thing is happening with illegal immigrants. Why would people want to hire illegal immigrants? Because it's cheaper. Who said that? All right, you know what that means? That means if I'm a business person and I tell you I'll paint your house for $500, I've got a business, I've got insurance, I've got to pay taxes. The perception of the illegal immigrant will come along and they'll do it for how much? $100. So what does that mean? Who are you going to hire? The illegal immigrant, or are you going to hire me for $500? The illegal immigrant for $100, or are you going to hire me for what? $500. Who's going to hire me for $500? Who's going to hire the illegal immigrant for $100? Wait a minute now. All right. Now, let's go back to slavery time. So they were concerned that if you allowed slavery to spread from the South into the North, what was going to happen to the wages of white workers? It would go down. Because now, if you can get it for 100, I got to do what? I got to drop my what? Drop my price. I got to drop my price. Right now, many people are complaining that they used to do yard work and they would charge $50 or $100. And then, lo and behold, here comes illegal immigrants, and they do it for $25. So what did that make them do? They gotta drop their prices. This was the same concern back then. So, Lincoln and the Republican Party were anti-slavery. Everybody hear that? But they were not in favor of ending slavery in the South. Anti-slavery to them meant, I don't want slavery to spread to the North, because if it spreads to the North, then the white workers up there not going to be able to make a living because their wages are going to do what? Depress. Does everybody understand that? Who is taking economics here?
You say who has taken it?
Economics.
Class?
Class. They teach economics here?
Yeah.
All right, that's basic economics. Cheap products, knockoff products. I told Dr. Ismail about the story when I was here at Dillard. I bought a Jordache sweater. That's the one with the horse on it. And I bought a Gucci sweater for $15 both. And at the time, a Gucci was going for like $35, the other one was going for like $40. I thought I had a good deal. And then I brought it back to my roommate, who was a good guy, and he knew dressing. He said, first off, Hersy, the horse head is turned backwards. So what does that mean? It was a knockoff. And then secondly, he said, I didn't even know Gucci made a male sweater. So what did that mean?
That was not Gucci.
It was a knockoff. But yet, I ain't paid $15. And I felt good until I met him. And I eventually stopped wearing it because too many people asked the same, made the same comments. But guess what it meant? I didn't have another $15 to go get the real thing. So that was going to cause what? Demand to go down on the legitimate sweaters, and the same thing happened in the music industry. Everybody know that? You know, I got a cousin that was big in the rap business. He owned Rap A Lot Records out of Houston. James Prince said that's why they got out the rap business. Because everybody started doing what? Illegal music. Everybody started down, so you couldn't sell a record. Everybody could get it for free. So they had to get out. They had to come up with a new way. That's what the environment was. So when the Republican Party founded, that's what their main concern was. And the people who drafted the 13th Amendment were part of that party. Lincoln was. So when they say Lincoln was anti-slavery, I used to think he was against slavery. But anti-slavery meant he was against the spread of slavery into the North. Another part of the Republican Party was abolitionists. Anybody know what abolitionists stood for? They wanted to abolish slavery. They wanted it wiped out. They didn't want it anywhere on the horizon. They thought it was evil. They thought God hated it. They thought it was a curse. So those two groups made up the Republican Party. I didn't know that. Lincoln, who was the president, the Republican Party was founded in 1860. Guess who was their first presidential candidate? Lincoln. He was elected in 1860. So when they got Lincoln and they started, their goal was to not end slavery, but to stop the spread of slavery, but their real goal was to protect the wages of white workers. Everybody understand that? So, that's the backdrop. Civil War took place. Slavery is a big discussion. When I studied it, it talked about slavery. It talked about Lincoln going back and forth on slavery. Sometimes he'll say he want to end it, sometimes he'll say he don't care about it. Now I understood why. It's because he wasn't an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery. He just didn't want it to spread to the North. He didn't want it to spread to the new territory. He didn't care about blacks. He didn't care about the condition that they were living under. And he at one point said, hey, if I can stay in the Union without freeing the slave, I will. He just didn't care. That's why I wore my jacket, Black Lives Matter. Everybody see it? Y'all already saw it before that, right? How does it look?
Nice.
All right, good, Dr. Ishmael. That's why I'm dressed the way I'm dressed. I want you to understand. Now, what does my bottom look like? It represents, I'm from Africa. That we started out from Africa. Now, what does my shirt look like? Red and white like the American flag. And what does my top look like? I'm now a black American. And what we're talking about is the lives of blacks just didn't matter back then. In fact, most immigrants came to this country to get a better life. Everybody know that? That's why the illegal immigrants are trying to get in now. They're going to get a better life. But do you know why Africans were brought to this country? To make life better for whites. We were the economic development plan. Our ancestors. Everybody know that? Did you know that? So when they said the first slave statutes, and I got the one here from Massachusetts, it basically applied to people brought into Massachusetts that was already a slave. So it basically said, if you go to Africa and you get you some slaves and you bring them to Massachusetts, we'll treat them as property and we'll protect them. So the way I want to show you was the intent is first I want to show you the legislative structure. I want to show you that. And then second, I want to show you the debate about the 13th Amendment. And then third, I want to show you the personal background of Senator Turnbull and Lincoln. To show you, and at the end, I want to be able to prove to you that this was their intent. And the nation was bamboozled. And so, I'm not going to try to challenge anybody. I want to try to let it speak for itself. So here's what I want you to do. The first slave statute was in Massachusetts, 1641. I'm going to read it to you. There shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us. That's the first slave statute. That's the first part of it. So what does that sound like he's about to do? Outlaw slavery, right? There should never be any slavery, bond slavery. And then what does it say? Unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. So the unless said what? You can have slavery if they fit in those three categories. Right? That's the first slave statute. What does it sound like? Doesn't it sound like the 13th Amendment? Neither shall there be slavery or involuntary servitude except the double negative. Now here's the most important thing. This statute, Massachusetts 1641, section 91, is known as the what? The first slave statute. Right? It's not known as the statute that prevented slavery. So when the 13th Amendment comes along and uses the same structure, the question is, why are we calling that an abolition statute when it did the same thing that the first one did? It should be called what? The statute that authorized slavery in the criminal justice system. Did everybody hear that? That's the first thing. Now, prior to, this is why I say it was intentional. Lincoln, as a legislature, drafted a statute to outlaw slavery in Washington, D.C. Lincoln, as a representative, drafted it in Congress. his statute didn't look like the 13th Amendment. It did not use the double negative. You with me? Everybody here? I want you to understand the role of the double negative. Let me tell you why it's important to me, because as a lawyer, I've drafted a lot of contracts, and I've interpreted contracts for people, and I always joke. So one of the tricks in contract drafting is I tell you what the statute, this contract says, but the words don't actually say that. So what happens when you go to court? What are people going to say? What do the words say? If the words say, I won't pay you $5 an hour, but I tell you I won't pay you $20 an hour, which one is the judge going to enforce?
What's on the paper?
Huh?
What's on the paper?
What's on the paper? And that's the same thing with statutes, even more so. So the 13th Amendment on paper does not abolish slavery. It ended what's called chattel slavery as we knew it, but it allowed, watch what it did. It allowed the South, who had just lost the war, and when they lost the war, what did that mean? They had to set the slaves free, right? So are they happy or mad about it? Huh? And mad. Like a hornet's nest. Then the 13th Amendment said, but since you control your criminal justice system, guess what you can do? You can re-enslave them through your criminal justice system. How did it allow that? That accept clause. Except you're duly convicted. Everybody hear that? In our country, states control their criminal justice system. Each state. So each state could decide, hey, I had to give up my slave. I don't have any more free labor. I want free labor. So what did they start doing? Who watched 13? What started happening in 13 after the Civil War?
They started putting black people in jail for like the war on drugs and everything like that.
They started doing what?
Putting black people in jail like.
Exactly. Because they could do that. Now, could the North or the federal government do anything about it? Not really. They could define what was they could say, walking down the street chewing gum with a hat on is a crime. They could say, if you don't go to class, that's a crime. And then they could what? And what they did soon after the 13th Amendment, 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. Blacks who had been convicted of a crime, you know what happened in the state of Maryland? They auctioned them off to a worker, a private person, to do work. Some of them did it for years. Isn't that what 13 talked about? See, other documentaries have talked about the consequence. I'm telling you that was the intent. And why do I say it was the intent? Because throughout, there have been other legislation dealing with slave statutes. And when they introduced it, I got the first one, the first statute that was introduced to say we're going to outlaw slavery. The very first one, legislation. And it did not have the accept clause in it. Are you surprised? It was by an abolitionist. But there were other statutes that had the accept clause in it. But all the statutes introduced for the 13th Amendment did not have the accept clause in it. So how did they get in there? Because Senator Turnbull, who was over the committee, put it in, reported it out, and when they got to the House, got to the floor of the Senate, there was a Senator Sumner from Massachusetts. He said, hey, this accept clause looks like it's going to allow slavery to continue. You know what Senator Turnbull said? Oh, no, you're just picky about words. It's not going to do that. So, they trusted it. But soon after it passed, guess what happened? the South, particularly Maryland and others, started auctioning prisoners off for private labor. And some of them stayed in for years. They have a bail. They couldn't pay the bail. They get a fine. They couldn't pay the fine. So some farmer would come along and say, hey, I'll pay his bail, I'll pay his fine. If you let her or let him come work for me, and he and the sheriff will agree, okay, they can work for you for 5 years. For a little old fine. So what just happened? They're back into slavery. So 13th, the movie talked about that. It showed that. Then while they were in, big coal companies needed mass workers. I mean, in the South now, slavery's gone. That's free labor. But they still wanted cheap labor. And guess what did they do? They went to what? The sheriff. So there are other articles that say, before slavery was by private individuals, after the 13th Amendment, slavery was by who? The government. Criminal justice system. Now let me tell you what the big difference was. I don't want to overlook this. Slave statutes were always passed state by state. So none of them looked the same. Slavery in Louisiana wouldn't be the same as slavery in Georgia. Though we refer to it all as chattel slavery, they had some little differences. Some say you can't kill your slave. Others say you can kill your slave. Some say slave got to go to church. Others didn't say that. Because it was state by state. And the way our country was set up, each state, like different speed limits, they could do that. Now, here's what was going on during this time that is relevant to you. Guess who was not in the legislature, who was not in the Senate at this time? Blacks. There were no blacks there. No blacks. So who was speaking up for the slaves? Nobody. And who do we need to speak there to speak up for the slaves? Huh? We needed all the criminal justice majors in this class. Somebody had to be there with knowledge to do what? Who said they wanted to help people? Somebody had to be there with knowledge to speak up. Because when nobody is there, guess what happened? Then, just what I told you happened. Senator Turnbull was a Democrat. He didn't care. He was a Democrat who in favor of slavery. Lincoln was a anti-slavery person. He was primarily didn't want it to spread. He didn't care about the slaves. The abolitionists who wanted to abolish slavery didn't have the clout. They had to stick with who? The other part of the Republican Party. And they did the best they could. Frederick Douglass was like the spokesperson for the blacks, but he didn't have a legal education. In fact, he was a runaway slave himself who was self-taught. So who was there to speak up? Now, why am I saying that? Because that's the same thing today. Today, the reason why they set up black colleges after the Civil War, so that blacks could have their own educated lawyers and educated people, educated criminal justice criminologists, educated social workers, educated finance people to what? Look out for the interest of blacks. And when blacks missed that opportunity in school, guess what they missed? They missed the opportunity to speak out. It's like having an interpreter. Everybody ever been to a place where nobody speaks English? Huh? Well, I have. And everybody's talking, but you don't know what's going on. You need somebody to tell you what's going on. So, anybody heard of what's this guy named, anyway, I'm going to think of it in a minute. He's called Talented Tip. Who am I talking about that first, man?
Talented who?
Tip. Anybody ever heard of the Talented Tip? W.B. Du Bois talking about the Talented Tip. He said the purpose of the Talented Tip is to look out for the other 90%. See, everybody's not going to get educated, but somebody has to be educated. And when students come to Dillard and other places and don't get educated, They missed an opportunity, and when you go back out, you can't speak up. Well, that's what happened. Nobody was there to speak up. Nobody was there to speak up, so guess what happened? They told blacks just what these statutes did. But the legal effect and consequence, they didn't know. How much time we got, Dr. Ishmael?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, all right. So that's the backdrop. So legislatively, they could have drafted it another way. All the others said, hey, we don't want any except clause. The original one by an abolitionist, that's what he said, no except clause. They overlooked that. In fact, the person from Missouri, who was a slave owner, he presented a statute. His didn't have the except clause. Like 5 other bills presented to abolish slavery. None of them had the except clause. But yet, he put it in. That's what I was looking for. Here's what it says. Mr. Ashley, this is 1863, also introduced a bill to provide for the submission to the states of a proposition to amend the national constitution prohibiting slavery or involuntary servitude in all of the states and territories now owned, of which may be hereafter acquired by the United States. Did you hear the except clause? No. Wasn't in there. Because he's an abolitionist. He wanted to abolish slavery. So when they used the except clause, they knew that it wasn't going to abolish slavery. It was just going to allow slavery within the criminal justice system. Everybody hear that? Now let me tell you why I know that. Way back in 1787, 1784, they had legislation dealing with slavery in what's called the Northwest Territory. They used the except clause. And I found some research. You know what that except clause was designed for? So there won't be any slavery. There won't be any involuntary servitude unless you've been convicted. And you know what it was designed for? For free blacks who came within a territory, if they wanted to make them slaves, guess what they would do? Convict them of a crime. Falsely or unfalsely. Convict them of a crime, and guess what you can do? You can sentence them to what? Slavery. That's in 1787. 1784. I'm not talking about 1860, 1870, almost 100 years before the technique had been used. Why? Because they wanted to make sure the labor of whites were protected. And the way you do that, you make sure you kept out what? You kept out blacks, free blacks, and you kept out slavery. Then they had another thing they implemented. There were 3 ways you could protect the labor of whites. Don't allow slavery to extend in. That's what the anti-slavery people wanted. Second, if slaves escaped into the territory, you allow people to come and take them back. That was called the Fugitive Slave Act. Anybody ever heard of that? Huh?
You said
The Fugitive Slave Act. And then the third way was if free blacks came into the territory, you could charge them with a crime and sentence them to slavery. And you know what that had the effect of doing? Free blacks wouldn't come in. Because they didn't want white labor to compete with the labor of free blacks. They felt like free blacks would work for little or nothing. And then that would cause the whites who wanted the work done, just like with your house, to get the lower wages. And then if they got the lower wages, then the whites could make what? The higher wages. So the way they can keep the amount that the white laborers were getting paid high, you got to what? Keep out blacks and the slaves. So here's what happens. That's what they wanted to do. Okay? But the Fugitive Slave Act, you all are familiar with it. Whoever saw 12 Years a Slave? Anybody know the movie 12 Years a Slave? Huh? You heard of it? You never watched it? 12 Years a Slave is about a man, first name Solomon, who was a free black in New York. And one day, I think it was in D.C., one day a slave catcher came and said, he's a runaway slave, and brought him back to Louisiana and put him on a plantation. He spent 12 years before he could prove he was free. So the Fugitive Slave Act said anywhere in America, if you find a runaway slave, you can get them, and then they would get free blacks, bring them back, sell them into slavery in the South that they were staying in. That's what 12 Years a Slave was about. Now, why is that important? Because the law again provided that you pass a law, and you can falsely accuse a black, and suddenly they're slaves. Any comments or questions on that? Now, let me tell you why all that's important. Why I still say it was the intent. Not just the consequence. Because Senator Turnbull was from Illinois. And you know what happened in Illinois? The same thing I'm just telling you about. But in 1855. 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, but in 1855, Illinois had laws to keep out free blacks. And Illinois is known as a what? Free state. Not a slave state, it's in the north. But guess what it did? It always wanted to have slavery. But they had federal legislation that stopped it, but it always wanted to. And it tried every technique it could to get around the prohibition that they couldn't have slavery. So here's what they did. They passed what's called black codes. Everybody ever heard that term? Right. Every black code I had ever heard of was passed after the Civil War, and it was passed by the South against free blacks, right? But the Illinois Black Code was passed in 1855 before the Civil War. You know what it provided for? If free blacks came in and didn't follow a registration law, they would get a fine. And then you know what they would do? They would sentence them to involuntary servitude. They would sell them to somebody who was going to pay their fine and put them to work. Does that sound familiar? Well, that's what happened as a result of the Accept Clause. That's what the South started doing after the passage of the 13th Amendment based on the Accept Clause. But Senator Turnbull, who was from Illinois, had already knew and already seen that the Illinois legislature did that before. And why is that important? Don't go to sleep on me. Why is that important? Somebody said, I'm just meditating. Let me tell you why that's important. Because it shows when he put the Accept Clause in the 13th Amendment, he knew that the South was going to use that just the way they used it to re-enslave blacks. That's why it's important. It's important because it shows how the law was used then and can be used now to enslave free people just by passing a law. And you know when they passed those laws, you know who was not here? Africans. In fact, in the history of slavery, most slavery started from conquering wars. American slavery started by passing a law against people who were not even in America. They couldn't even vote. They weren't even here. Our ancestors were not even here. So they used the law, and then over the years, they kept using the law. And the 13th Amendment was the next time of using the law. Let me end with this. Two things. There was a Northwest Ordinance that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And all I ever heard about the Northwest Ordinance was it prohibited slavery. Thomas Jefferson was trying to keep slavery from spreading in the country. He was trying to get rid of slavery. Well, you know what made that odd, don't you? Anybody know anything about Thomas Jefferson? He had a black woman named Hemingway. What's her name? Sarah Hemingway. He had a lot of babies by her. He never freed her. his black children by Sally Hemingway. He never freed her. So I was like, why was he trying to free every other slave and wouldn't free what? His own children, right? Does that make sense to you? Well, you know what I found out? That statute wasn't trying to free slavery. It was trying to keep slavery from spreading into the North. It just sounded like, neither shall there be slavery or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime after being duly convicted. It sounded like it says, keep slavery out. But it also said, hey, but if you found a slave in the territory, you can come and get them, and we'll make the law hit them. And I found a commentary that said no. At the time he proposed it, the abolitionists opposed it. They said no, he's not against slavery. And then they said, hey, by the way, that except clause, as far back in the 1700s, was designed to target free blacks who weren't slaves and to make them a slave by using the criminal justice system. 1781. So guess what? 1787. So by the time you get to the 13th Amendment and they're drafting it, they already knew. Senator Turnbull and Lincoln already knew what the consequence was going to be. But guess who didn't know? The slaves didn't know. Why? Because the slaves, most of them couldn't read and write. And the ones that could read and write weren't lawyers. They didn't have the history we have now. So what I wanted to do was present it to you. Let me just mention one last thing. There's that phrase called duly convicted. Right? It's in all the legislation. But in the 13th Amendment, it does not define what's duly convicted. What does that mean? In the original legislation, you know what duly convicted means? You got to be judged by a jury of your peers. You couldn't have an excessive bail. After slavery, blacks couldn't even serve on juries. They couldn't even testify against whites. So when they used the term duly convicted in the 13th Amendment, they didn't define it. They left it up to who? The former slave owners. And what do you think they did? They did whatever they wanted. So that's my presentation. Last thing I want you to know is what we have right now, and I've been telling people for years, that our Louisiana system is really just a system of slavery. But who's doing something to end it? You know what everybody says? Well, I'm not in there. But I guarantee everybody in here has a relative who's in the prison. Am I right or wrong? Or you know somebody. Well, if you're not knowing somebody, you, at any point in time, you can be falsely accused and you can be in prison. Right now, Louisiana has the highest incarceration. Shreveport has the highest rate, one of the highest in the country, on people sentenced to what? The death penalty. Did you know that? And up until 2 years ago, they had a Confederate monument sitting outside the courthouse. And we fought to get it down, but it took years. Why? Because people said it's okay. But what the stats and the research says, that when people see things like that, whites from the north and from the south, it makes them angry and judge blacks harsher, which is a form of slavery. That's my presentation. I thank you for taking the time out to listen. Any questions?
What do you currently do now for work, or are you still in law?
Excuse me?
Are you still currently in law?
I am.
Okay.
In fact, I'm putting together a law firm in D.C. to file suit to declare the accept clause invalid. And I've been pushing, I ran for sheriff in Shreveport a few years ago, one of my platforms was end slavery in the criminal justice system. See, let me show you what the legacy of slavery is. Everybody know what chattel slavery was? It meant you had no rights. It meant the slave owner could do whatever they wanted with your body. You know what that meant? They wanted to rape you, they could rape you. They wanted to rape your wife, they could rape your wife. They wanted to beat you, they could beat you. They didn't want to feed you, they wanted to castrate you, they wanted to cut your foot off, they wanted to do whatever, cut your tongue out. They could do that. Everybody know that? Did everybody know that's what slavery was? All right. Do you know for years that was the same way in the criminal justice system? Only up until the last 15, 20 years, maybe 30 years, the lawyers started suing to have conditions that were humane in the prison, including New Orleans jail, the parish jail. Why? Because people felt like I can do whatever I want to you as a prisoner because what? I could have done whatever I wanted to with you as a what? As a slave. You know what? I'll tell you why I brought this poster in here. What does it say they're going to start doing? Prior to the end of slavery, if the slave master killed the slave, it was not a crime. Because they defined slaves as property. They can do whatever they want with them. They wanted to rape the slave's wife. They wanted to rape the slave. They can do whatever they want. So right now, what has happened is, in our criminal justice system, they can pay the slave, they got to pay him at least, I think, $1 a day, $1 an hour. Yes, ma'am.
$1 a day.
$1 a day. And they can work for billion-dollar corporations making lots of money. So, slavery ended for all blacks and all descendants of Africa. That ended. But it continued for those that they saw fit to sentence. And that's whether you're innocent or guilty. Once you get convicted and they put you into prison, you know what they tell you in the prison? They tell you who you're going to have sex with. And who do they tell you you're going to have sex with in the prison? You're not going to have sex with your wife anymore if you're male. Who you reduced to having sex with? Other men. If you're a woman, you're not going to have sex with another man. Who you reduced to having sex with? That's just what they did with the slaves. If they wanted to put you out and work you in the field, they could do that. Hard labor, that's what the term hard labor came from. So one of the consequences of the 13th Amendment, it set the conditions and allowed the warden to say, you can treat them just like we used to treat slaves. Any other questions? So one of the things we're doing is to push. Now, let me say this, in Louisiana state constitution has the accept clause too. But there have been efforts, I know they put it on the ballot about 2-3 years ago. It didn't work out, but they're trying to take that out. But the main thing we need to make sure is, and I say this, if a worker is working in the criminal justice system and they're making money, guess who needs that money? Their children at home need that money. Their wife at home needs that money. They have child support, they have family obligations. Why should an employer get rich by paying them $1 when they can do what? They can pay somebody $5 or pay somebody $8. So what do you think happens to that $7 difference? The sheriff gets some, and guess who else gets some? The employer. Now let me end with this so you can understand why this is so important. While slavery is something you want to be on the lookout for. America became a great nation based on slavery, right? You know China became a great nation based on low wages? Everybody know that? You know who else just became a great economic power based on low wages? India. Any country that has low wages, guess what's going to happen? They're going to get rich. Now, The last relevant thing is, that's related to my topic, is Trump's order on mass deportation of immigrants. Everybody familiar with that? Everybody familiar with that? Okay. The first day he announced that inauguration, the next 2 days, in Arizona, American Indians were rounded up as suspected of being illegal immigrants. And if they had not been able to prove their citizenship, guess what was going to happen? They would have been deported. Just like 12 years a slave. Why? Because the law, once you say illegal immigrants has to go, what does the illegal immigrant look like? You know what it looks like, Dr. Ishmael? Does anybody tell me what an illegal immigrant looks like? People say, oh, they're Hispanic. Well, not all Hispanics are illegal immigrants. Or Asians, but Haitians. How do you tell a Haitian from a regular black? So just what happened way back then, just by passing the law, just by Trump saying, I'm deporting mass deportation of illegal immigrants, a whole lot of people who are not illegal immigrants are going to do what? Get caught up in it. And by the time they get caught up in it, and they sit in jail long enough, they would have lost their job, they could have lost their family, they could have lost everything until they can prove their innocence. That's the power of the law. And that's what happens when you don't have people that look like you and I, people with our interests at heart, even if they don't look like us, at the table to say what? You can't do that. Any other questions? So I'm trying to end by saying, hey, your education is important. And people need you. People who don't get educated need you. And look at what happened with blacks in the criminal justice system from 1865 to today. Because we didn't have anybody sitting at the table speaking up for us. That same thing can happen again. Dr. Ishmael.
More round of applause.
Can I ask one question? My premise is that it was intentional. Did I convince you? Everybody who thinks I was convinced it was intentional, raise your hand.
Who does not think so?
People who didn't convince or don't think so, raise your hand. Well, you didn't raise your hand, young man. You did?
Yes, sir.
You raised it under the table. All right, I missed
That
it.
says your book's gonna be a bestseller.
Huh? Well, I hope so, but I thank you for letting you be my guinea pig and test it out. And any things you think I need to change, just provide it with Dr. Ishmael. You can tell it to my face, I close my eyes, I don't have to feel this too bad. All right, thank you.
All right, before we leave, I get everybody signed in. Make sure you complete the evaluation. I posted the Gulf Side Assembly evaluation that didn't work last week. Did y'all see that? Yeah, please go ahead and complete that. That is work. So we're going to take a group photo with our speaker before he leaves. You can get everybody in. And make sure you turn in your evaluations.
Thank you.